Hello, welcome to a new session of the Strategic Studies Seminar. Tonight we will be speaking about Jomini, who is another classic of strategy, who lived during the period of Napoleon the Great. He was a staff officer and he wrote a lot about strategy in a classical perspective, strategy as the art of the commander. This is the outline. So we have an introduction, the main arguments, some definitions, and specifics like the typology of wars. He's taught about strategy and the principles of war. Okay, this is also part of the strategy studies seminar that I taught a few years ago, and I thank you, Mr. Radu Kuguta, for allowing me to develop the seminar on YouTube. The chapters. There are two chapters here from selection from two chapters from Du Jomini, The Art of War, published in the 19th century and first in French. Why we speak about Jomini? So one way to understand that is to look at news. For example, there was a news that Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, argued that the war in the Middle East can derive support the from Ukraine. This underlines that logistics and communications and provision and supply matter a lot for warfare. So, and Jomini perspective about a lot of it is about supply, the meaning of supply, and why cutting the supply matters for the result of war. The other news is about the Strait of Hormuz, and everybody knows that now a lot of oil goes through there, and this is also related to the issue of to control the line of communication. So he who controls the lines of communication in the major war theater, war space, has a important position and can win the war. So the Strait of Hormuz, the control of Strait of Hormuz is important. Okay, let's look at the main arguments. One is that Jomini proposed a typology of war, like a kind of classification, and this typology of wars was based on his experience during Napoleonic wars. And there here you see the types of wars. For most of them, you can find an example during the French Revolution or Napoleonic wars. Now, this is the one argument. There's a had a typology of roles, a classification based on his experience. The second argument idea is that for Jomini, strategy means the workplace. So it's a very top-down perspective, not just top-down perspective. It's a great power perspective because France was the most for almost 2 decades the most important power in Europe, at least in the continental Europe. And the last argument is that if you want to win a war, so the principles of war are ideas about how to effectively and efficiently wage war. And the main principles of war is to concentrate your force, usually against the enemy's weakest point, and hit him hard. So hit him energetically. So you either hit the army or you maneuver against his line of communications, because if you cut off the supply, the army will have to make a bad decision or surrender. So this is important, as we spoke of before. Supply matter. The most important example for Germany, as we will see in this seminar, are the Napoleonic Wars, but there are also other examples of Germany strategy. For example, guerrilla warfare, because guerrilla warfare is about a lot of guerrilla warfare is about communications and patience. We will see that these principles show up in Jomini. Another example is the wars of Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great relied on something called maneuvers uh, of internal lines of communications, and this will be exemplified here. So basically, you move between opposite forces, you try to beat them one by one. So this is the key of Frederick the Great strategy. Another example is the 1991 Iraq War. Well, Jomini is very influential for the U.S. military. The U.S. military relies a lot on strategy, its strategy relies a lot on logistics, technology, lines of communication, and firepower. And during this war, Jomini was even quoted by a general, the commander of the American forces, that he recommended a ratio of supply to the forces deployed. So Jomini actually had some kind of an operational influence even more than a century after his death. And the last example is Shock and Awe. Shock and Awe is basically the 2003 campaign against Iraq, which was based on precision strike. Precision strikes hit the lines of communication and then hit the force. So this basically, as we saw, the third argument of Jomini, taken from Jomini, if you can hit the enemy communication. And here, communication means not just the technical aspect like the wires and so on, the satellite and the radars, but also means the pathways and so on. Okay, let's look at some definition. Jomini was trained a bit in the 18th century tradition, and the 18th century tradition was very systematic, so he had some definition. One was grand tactics, which today is called operation. Remember from the first course, there are several levels of war. One is called strategic, the other, which is about the whole war and campaigns and so on. The other is about fights, is the tactical level of war, and in between there's another level now called operations, but it was called at the time grand tactics. So it's about how to move the forces and prepare for a battle. The other definition is about logistics, which is about supplying the army. The third definition of Jomini is about his view on strategy, which is the art of making war on map. So Jomini was a staff officer, and planning was important. And the last definition is about the principle of concentration. Focus your power, gather your power, and use it against the enemy's weakest point, or use it against the enemy's communication. Not all strategies think like that, because, for example, in Clausewitz, you must hit the center of gravity, and the center of gravity is not always the weakest point. Now we look at the Jomini typology of wars. I selected only a few cases because some of them they are still important today. And the first is aggressive war. So how a general of Napoleon time, which was an aggressive leader, Napoleon was an aggressive leader. So how aggressive leaders see aggressive wars. So there are two types of aggressive war. One is in your neighborhood against your in proximity, and the other is at distance. At distance, which is today called the power projections. Jomini argued that under certain circumstances, aggressive wars are justified, and they sometimes also they are effective. Today, aggressive wars are less effective than in the 19th century. There are statistics about that. He also agreed that preventive and preemptive wars are justified, are sometimes good. Preventive war is a war started toward a very distant threat. So if a country can become a great power in the future, a preventive war may stop the great power before it becomes a threat. Preemptive wars are wars against an imminent threat. So if your the other side is gathering the forces at your border and he has clearly the intent to attack, if you hit him first, this is preemption. As we see today with the war in Iran, both arguments are used in discourses and debates. And another idea of Jomini is that all the use of force must be proportionate with its goal. Of course, because Napoleon invaded Russia and lost, Jomini is skeptical about wars, great offensive, aggressive wars at distance, and he argued that diplomacy is more important, and the aggressive wars often fail if the enemy is prepared for them. So he's strongly motivated to fight because today is called gradient of power. So power at distance is it decreases. So you are stronger at your borders, and as you go far and far away, your military power is less effective. And he argues that diplomacy should be used also for your neighbors. So he said that, like all strategies, he's argued that we must think very good about how to use force and when to use force, and balance with care the goods and bads. The other type of war are wars of opinion. So they are basically ideological warfare. For example, fundamental theories today are can be included here. In this case of wars, of conflicts, the ideology is the motive, in the other times is the pretext. These wars of opinion are not simply army against army, sometimes they are inside the societies, or sometimes they are transnational. They have a high chance of success, like 50% is a lot for a war, for Jomini, because they are based on passions. Now, here Jomini tells obvious things because he write for an audience who witnessed the French Revolution and Napoleonic warfare directly. So he speaks common things. He argues that if you face an ideological enemy, patience is more important than intervention. So you shouldn't always run with intervention. This is also based on the experience of French Revolution. When the conservative power intervened against French Revolution, they basically galvanized. They created a nationalist reaction, and the French regime won those wars. Ideologies, not just from the revolution side, also the conservative or the reactionary are motivated by ideology than by feelings. The last war, he called them national wars, and today they are called wars of national liberation. They are a combination of guerrilla and resistance movements, and they are pretty diverse. Now, uh, Napoleon invaded Spain, and a guerrilla rouse as a reaction to Napoleon, and Napoleon lost this war too. So Napoleon lost two big wars, one in Russia and the other in Spain. In both cases, the partisans play a role. Their role was very important, especially in Spain. Partisan movements were combined with conventional forces. In case of Spain, there was the British Expeditionary Force led by the Duke of Wellington, the future Duke of Wellington. And there are several conditions in which these national wars are more effective. For example, geography matters. If the guerrilla has an isolated base, and if the guerrilla can be supplied from outside. So these are the most important geographical conditions. And the last idea is that preparation for national war, like militia and so on, they may be a deterrent for an invasion. So these are the important. The three types of war which we discuss: the offensive wars, the ideological wars, and the let's say guerrilla national wars. They are still important today, and they deserve a special attention. Now, after this typology of war, another point is his conception of strategy. Now, he sees strategy as a part of a bigger picture, a system alongside grand tactics, as we saw before, called operation today, logistics, tactics, and engineers. And for him, strategy is more or less about planning. Now, strategy has some specific task. One is to understand very well the future of war, the type of war which is planned. Yeah, and it has some details like the objective of forces, the base of operation. The base of operation is a place where the army can rest and has supplies and so on, and the zone of operation. And between the base and the objective, there are lines of operation, so the direction, the sense of the movement of the army. And for Jomini, a lot of strategies about to move the army from a place to another and prepare for combat. The combat is the tactics, and the strategy is how to prepare it in a way. Here he resembles a lot Clauser. He also taught the strategies about how to prepare the force for battle. This is basically a conclusion based on Napoleonic experience. Now, in many books of military strategies, there are principles of war, and sometimes the list is bigger, and Jomini play a role in their conception. The most important principle is to concentrate all your power, all your military power, and hit the enemy in his weakest points, and hit the enemy in the communication, as we saw. And he make a list. There are additional conditions. One is to maneuver and to move the army against pieces of the enemy army, if possible. So to have a superiority, or to have local superiority. And another is well, no, that's kind of all. Okay, now we can look at Jomini in practice. So this sounds very theoretical, but there are several examples of Napoleonic strategy which illustrates what are Jomini's points. So look here, somewhere in behind, so somewhere up is the enemy's base, and here this is the line of operation, and this is the enemy. His goal is to defeat you, and you must face him. One option is to do an envelopment. So an army has a center here, and on the left side and the right side there are the flanks, and you maneuver around the flanks and hit the enemy's line of communication. So you draw the enemy and hit him from behind, and this way you surround the enemy. So the enemy is fighting from a difficult position. He's not very well supplied. Also because he surrendered, the morale drops. So you basically increase your chances to win. This is the first, let's say, maneuver, and it's basically what a part of what Germany actually tells here. Another example is the Federation maneuver of interior lines. So there are two armies, two enemies, and you are somewhere in between them. So you must be careful to stay in between them. You hit one. You also are careful that these two armies don't support each other. So you hit one and hit the other. So even if they together they are stronger than you, you can use your position to defeat them one by one. This is another maneuver. Is also recommended by Jomini, and it was encountered during Napoleonic warfare. And the last one is basically the simplest maneuver: brute force. You breach the opposite side, you breach the front, and you maneuver. You go to your objectives. These are basically how Jomini's strategy looks in practice, especially the first two. And his recommendation are based on Napoleon battles and Napoleon operations. He was in the staff of Marshal Ney, which was one of the most important commanders, marshals of Napoleon. And basically, his whole point about strategy is how to use military power, and he recommended to use maneuver and movement and to cut the enemy's communication. So that's basically Jomini, and he also put a lot of emphasis upon planning. Therefore, Jomini is very top down. He also writes from the position of, let's say, French Napoleonic staff officer, which means an imperial perspective, has an imperial perspective upon how to use military power, and the military power is using, let's say, offensively, or at least he emphasized movement. So his preferred form of strategy is to move and cut off the enemy. Strategy is about how to plan a war and to prepare for a war and how to use your forces during the war. He identified several types of war, like aggressive, ideological, and national wars. These three are the most important for today, in our time, because we saw aggressive wars like Russia's aggression against Ukraine. You also saw ideological conflict, international terrorism, or was motivated either by liberal or by religious ideology. We also see national wars, including guerrilla terrorism and a combination between asymmetric conflicts. So each type of war was known during Napoleon time, and they were theorized and they were studied. And the most important thing to remember from Jomini is this idea for concentrative power. So basically, you gather all your power, your main, let's say, main army, and use it against the weakest points. In this case, the weakest points of the enemy army or the communications. He, his preferred maneuver was against communications. Now, of course, if both sides do that, the result is messy. Okay, so there are several things to debate. One is descriptive. What are the main components of Germany's strategic perspective? We saw battles, bases, objectives, lines of communication, so on. The second idea is whether he's still relevant today. Well, s- his influence upon both the, let's say, the American military and the Russian military and the British military and also the French are, suggest that he must be read, because you understand why these armies do certain things and not others. There are classical comparisons of Jomini with Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. He's somewhere in between Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. All of them argue, and Machiavelli argued that war is a political phenomena, and the war should be controlled by the politician, the political decision makers. They all argue that strategy requires a lot of thinking and planning, and that is often unpredictable. Jomini was more on the controlling side, so he thought that war can be used and can be planned with details. The typology of war, there are more wars than we talk about, and his typology of war sometimes is messy because he uses a lot of criteria which they intersect. So you can class one war in different types, so, which is a bit confusing. And the last thing which can be discussed is about how to use the his typology, Jomini's typology, to understand the contemporary wars. So we saw that we still have strategic maneuvers. There were strategic maneuvers in 2003, and there were strategic maneuvers in the beginning of the second full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine, and so on. So people still, especially today, try to win wars by clever maneuvers and by hitting communications. So in a way, I'm not saying that it's the foremost strategist for today, but it's important for today if you want to think about a war as a way to achieve political goals. Thank you, and we will see you next time.